Hi everyone, hope you're awake. Yeah, I've got the graveyard shift, so I'll try and be as lively as possible. There will be questions asked, so don't fall asleep. So, first of all, you'll notice this is not branded, it's not affiliated with a company that I may have a day job with that is sponsoring. But the other thing to note is that I've learned a lot of this information from just things I've picked up from hearsay, from chatting to people in the industry, and from some Google Earth KMZs that I may have found lying around. Some of it might be wrong. Some of it probably is wrong. Please don't sue me. So we've been talking about the various layers. Usually in UKNOF we talk a lot about layers, 1 if we're lucky, but usually 2, 3 and above. This is what I call layer 0, or the dirty layer, because it tends to be holes in the ground, as per previous presentation on in Balquidder. A lot of this stuff is actually the sort of places that you never actually get to see. I have this terrible habit of wandering the streets and staring at the floor, which is awful in a place like Edinburgh, where you should really be looking at the wonderful architecture and whatever else. But the reason for that is because there's this fascinating history around the country that is baked into every manhole cover, and it tells you a lot about the telecoms industry over the last 30 plus years. So I'll give you a bit of a guide to that horrible affliction that I have. And I'll also hopefully give you a bit of a history lesson, and then talk a bit at the end about how people go about building these things these days. So, start at the beginning. These chambers that we're constantly seeing in the street, this is some ones that City Fibre were building not far away from Nick's house, down a lane. That there is a footway chamber. So we talk about, this is the terminology that the New Roads and Streetworks Act use, which is a footway and a carriageway. Footway is the pavement, carriageway is the road. So they are normally concrete infill lids that you will have seen. Sometimes they're composite, sort of plastic, but usually concrete infill with a badge in the middle that shows whose network that is. The chambers themselves are these stackable rings, which you can use to get a height depending on what it is you're trying to build. So if you need only 2 or 3 because you need a shallow box, you can just use that. Or if you need to build something really deep to hold loads of fibre joints and whatever else is going to go in there, then you can make them as big as you like. The only difference between the ring construction is just the material, and it's all to do with the amount of tonnage that the boxes are going to take. So it's 25 tons for a footway box and 40 tons, that's wrong. 40 tons, which is the D400 for carriageway. In some heavy duty roads, the council will ask for a D600, which is a 60 ton iron lid. Various different sizes. So yeah, apologies, I didn't want to put any particular brand on there, so I just made one up. You get the footway 2s, 4s, 5s, 6s. They don't seem to have any particular kind of structure to why they're called that. They just are. I think an awful lot of this was invented by our incumbent at some point many, many years ago, and it's just stuck. So if you're speaking to contractors or whatever about building, I want a 2-way duct system from here to here, and I want footway 4s every 200 meters or whatever. That's roughly the sort of size and shape. You'll recognize those rough sizes and shapes if you go outside and look in the street. So that's footway, and then carriageway tend to be, there are various other sizes, but these are the sort of main ones, and that's a bit more structured on carriageway boxes. You get 1, which is a single lid, 2, which is 2, and 3, which is 3. So that will hopefully resonate with most of you who've seen these things in the street. You understand, right? Next time I need to speak to a civils contractor, that's what they're called. So the other thing you will have noticed about all these manholes is obviously the badge in the middle, or the badge that's riveted to the edge in the case of carriageway boxes, that shows the network. And this is the fascinating thing to me, because there's all these different names, many of which, when I started looking at this, I had no idea who they were. And it really encouraged me to go and learn about them and look up all their Wikipedia pages. And many of them, amazingly, have, even on the internet, just sort of disappeared into the background. There's very little documentation on it. You know, a company's house registry of some business called that was dissolved in 2001, along with millions of other businesses in 2001 that went bust. You know, there's this huge lost history in all these networks. And actually, one of the questions is, does anyone own them? Does anyone use them? Are they still active? Have they just been lost? And there's a good question around that. And I don't know whether anyone will ever find out. So, like I say, there's loads of street furniture with defunct brands sitting on it. The 2000 dot-com boom-bust thing, there was an enormous telecoms sort of, I don't know what the word is, but they all just disappeared overnight or ended up getting amalgamated into one another. And it still goes on today, but particularly at the time, there was a lot of people putting duct in the ground. And it started to happen again now with the likes of City Fibre and Virgin Media's Project Lightning and whatever else. But at the time, there were just loads of different companies all just overlapping each other and building different duct networks. And hopefully, what we can do now is go through some of those, and what we'll do is ask you whether you can maybe tell me who the current brand is. So, first of all, you're not allowed to answer if you've looked ahead on the slides, because I know they're on the website. And second of all, if you work for the company and you know the answer because you work for the company, don't answer. So, again, we'll not bother with mics, but if anyone wants to put up their hand and shout it out if I point at you. Does anyone know who the national telephone company is today? No? Okay, this one will get very obvious very quickly. It's now it then became the GPO. Anyone? BT. You're correct. That one is now BT. So originally, one of the companies that became the GPO, the biggest one was National Telephone Company. The only real remnant of that these days is a lovely building in Birmingham, which is no longer a BT building, unfortunately. It's an office, but it's the old National Telephone Company main exchange in Birmingham.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Same consumer, it's not the 124 NTC on as well.
There are some very old ones in very peculiar places that are round, and they have NTC that just about visible. I've found. No. I'm using this. Sorry, I'm using this as a sort of illustration of what the lid might be on today. Cubis, for example, the manufacturer of the lids didn't exist when the NTC was around. I'm just lazy. Anyone tell me who 186K is today? This one should be obvious to a lot of you.
Is it?
Yes, it is. So 186K was obviously built with Transco. Transco got merged into all sorts of other things, and the phoenix that rose out the ashes of that was Geo, and Geo obviously recently got sold to Zayo. So it's an interesting one, 186K, because 186K, as I'll point out later, is one of the few networks that genuinely is a national contiguous duct network. There's not many of them. You'd be surprised. Yeah, so Transco was the business or Transco's parent company built it in conjunction with, when they got all the way leaves to build the gas mains, they also put a duct system in, and that was originally for Hutchison Whampoa, and Hutchison obviously became Hutchison 3G, and they were ultimately the main tenant of that. British Rail Telecom, now not Network Rail Telecom, but British Rail Telecom. Anyone? You've already answered one. Go on then.
Somewhere in that you'll have, I've forgotten one of the names, but just say Raycom, but another one.
Well done.
It's thinking after that. It's Fibre, is that Tanet and FibreNet? Yes.
Who's that? Yeah, I think Raycal, because Raycal was the original fibre network that underpinned the Vodafone mobile network. There's probably a fair bit of overlap with Vodafone at points, before Vodafone obviously bought Cable and Wireless. Which brings me on to, anyone? Sorry? Correct. So Scottish Power Telecom became Scottish Telecom. In parallel to that, not at the same time, Norweb, which was Northern Power Grid, became rebranded to Eurocoms. Both of those became Thus. Well, Scottish Telecom rebranded to Thus, became a PLC. Eurocoms was acquired by Thus. In parallel to that, obviously, there was the Mercury network, which became Cable and Wireless, which Thus acquired. And today, that is all Vodafone. Oh, I've missed another one. Christ. You're right. I have missed Energis. Energis was related to Mercury, wasn't it, originally? Was it separate to Mercury? Right. Yep. A bit like Scottish Power Telecom, yep. Right. I'm sure there's lots of crossover between all of these, and you're right, I have absolutely missed Energis. Energis was a big one that got swallowed into Cable and Wireless. Not FiberNet, which we've already covered. Anyone know Fiberway? Well done. Sky via what became Ipsaris, then EasyNet, and now today Sky. So there you are. Then this one's obvious. I couldn't be bothered building in all the steps for this. I mean, I think the first one that was created was Croydon Cable. There's probably others that I've missed there. I picked the main ones that I sort of identified as main arterial routes into what was NTL and Telewest. Obviously, now what's interesting about the badges here is these badges, okay, they're not today's modern badges, but these badges all will exist somewhere wherever these network operators are out of franchise. So in their franchise, the badges will all say CATV, or largely, in most franchises, they'll say CATV, which stands for cable TV. Out of franchise, where they were in someone else's franchise area, they had to identify their boxes as who they were. So for example, Edinburgh was a Telewest franchise area, so NTL network in Edinburgh is badged NTL instead of CATV, vice versa in Glasgow or anywhere else. The only one that sort of got added in at the last minute, which is of course today's Virgin Media, was Small World, which had some stuff on the west of Scotland and I think northwest of England, and that was brought into Virgin Media in 2014. Otherwise, they were all parts of Telewest and NTL. I'm sure there were other brands that I couldn't identify that became into NTL. The only one I could actually find was CableTel. Right. 9X? Yep. Sorry? Videotron. Christ, I don't know that one. Okay, so yeah, I've missed a few. But the point is there. These networks are all existing, and they all became what is today Virgin Media. I mean, I don't think there's any. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's any independent cable TV networks now, other than who's that? Sorry. Oh, of course. Well, yeah. I think excluding the islands. True. Yeah, well, there's obviously consolidation yet to happen. We'll maybe do another one of these in a few years when BT have bought everyone up. So who shares with who? Now this is an interesting thing because obviously, like I said at the beginning, there's not actually that many independent contiguous duct networks around the UK. And the way that this works is there's obviously a market for dark fibre, and there's a market for subduct lease. So when you're building a box in the ground, and you might have a duct going through it, or 2 or 4 or 6 or however many it is, you can sell, as the owner of that, you can sell a subduct. And that's really nice because someone else will come along and build standoff chambers wherever they want to put their own joints, and they blow a cable down one of your subducts, and they can say that they've got their own fibre network across that route. The reality is they're having to do that at a fraction of the cost of what it would be to build a new duct network. So normally these subducts are somewhere between 15 mil inside diameter and 30 mil inside diameter. Newer ones are smaller because we're using blown technology to get them in, whereas older, larger ones were roped, so you had to make them bigger. And the way that that would work is, let's say, for example, Zayo have ducts. They would use some of those subducts for cables that they use for themselves, and inside those cables there may be fibers that they have lit themselves, and there may be fibers that they have leased as dark fiber to other people. But there may also be subducts in that main duct that are leased entirely, and there's a lot of that going on in the industry. In other places, so particularly on the railway, where we've got what is now CenturyLink's network, it's not so easy to do subduct lease because the cables are laid in a trough by the railway. But there is the same idea of a licensed trough, if you like, and you're allowed to put a cable in it. And there's a fair bit of that going on too. The problem this causes is that there's actually not as much resilience in the UK as you would have thought. And what day job, we find that when people are buying a circuit and they just assume, hey, I can buy something from TalkTalk and I can buy something from Virgin Media, or I can buy something from Sky and I can buy something from Virgin Media, or whatever it might be, they presume that not only is there resilience in the local network, but they're entirely independent networks across the UK, and that's not the case. And it's very hard to actually find out, unless you are buying dark fiber or wavelengths where you may be given you may have the actual fiber route exposed to you. It's very, very hard to find out whose network is where. That's what subducts look like. So that's some older ones. I think that's an that's a Sky manhole with, and you can see that one of the subducts has come loose and there's a rope through it. That's one of the older ones, and 2 or 3 of those will be Skies, 2 or 3 of those will be leased, 2 or 3 of them will be empty, waiting for future cables to go into them. That's what high-vis and Chapter 8 compliant vans for, I think. So who else is sharing? Believe it or not, and Neil, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, I think BT does actually have 2 or 3 places that it shares. So the one I was talking to you earlier about, which is up to Shetland, I know for a fact that BT uses a pair of fibres in that. And it's my understanding that BT still has some fibres pre 92 or whenever it was that the railway stuff that was still there. So maybe not. That's a bit of hearsay. Yeah, I thought maybe not, but Virgin Media. Yeah, Virgin Media does largely own it. Well, it entirely owns its metro network, but in the long distance, there's evidence of it going down the railways again. The railways are a really common recurring theme, so presumably CenturyLink's network. When we look at maps that we've got there, they've obviously got enormous density in metros where they've built cable network, but outside of the metros, it seems to follow the railway paths. Yep. BT sell dark fibre to someone? All right, sure. So Virgin Media, obviously, you know, they've got a long distance network. They have a national network as far as I think Dundee in terms of the north, and Northern Ireland, obviously, and they do have their own cable over the water, and everywhere in between that kind of links up is either their own asset, but in a lot of places, like Neil says, it's shared. Sky, now they, obviously the Ipsaris network was built as a JV with British Waterways, so where there are canals, you'll find that Sky Network is actually a 2-duct network that is in the canal towpath. Where it's not in the canals, there is some duct in roadsides and other places, but largely, again, that is a dedicated cable, is my understanding, inside CenturyLink, i.e. railways. SSE, this is a really good example of a network that has been coupled together with everyone's fibre. So SSE have a subduct lease in Zayo's network. They lease subducts and fibre from Virgin, from Vodafone. They've got their own stuff on the pylons in areas that they manage the distribution network for the power. And they've got some metro where they've either had to build for a customer connection or where they have inherited it. A good example of that is Aberdeen. Atlantic Telecom went bust in 2001 and had built a cable network in Aberdeen. And the only other customer on that network was Scottish Hydro, because it connected up their two computer centres at the north and south of the city. When Atlantic went bust, they were kind of left without anyone operating the network, so they adopted it. So there is actually a reasonable amount of metro footprint in Aberdeen that is now SSE's. And I'm sure there's other examples of places where that's happened. So SSE have some metro, some of their own fibre on the transmission lines, and everything else is a very good example of how to lease from other people, either subduct or dark fibre layer. So just to rattle off a few more, SURF is similar to SSE, power lines where they own them, otherwise a share in other people's networks. EU Networks has obviously a fair chunk of metro in London, some of that's shared, some of it's not. Zayo is their long distance network that takes them up to Manchester and Leeds. KCOM, that was a build share with Colt, so they actually, I'll show you an example of what a build share looks like in a minute, but basically where they share the contractor and they build one scar down the pavement and two sets of boxes and two sets of ducts. KCOM since sold its national network outside of Hull to City Fibre. Colt still operates theirs. GTT, now this is a complicated one. GTT bought Interroute bought EasyNet version 2, which was the management buyout of EasyNet version 1, which is what was Ipsaris, now Sky. So as a result, Interroute has IRUs in Sky's network. It also bought Vitesse, so it's got IRUs in Zayo's networks and other people's networks as a result of that. So Interroute is another example of really good sharing, where just by virtue of their history, they've inherited IRUs with all sorts of people. Just for clarity, IRU is indefutable right of use. It's basically a way of doing a capitalized lease. So you're effectively leasing subduct or fibre or whatever it is, but you pay some millions of pounds up front for 20 years or 100 years or however long it is. It's a way of putting a lease on your balance sheet. So in the telecoms days where there was money flying around for this is what a lot of people did, and there was a bit of dodginess going along with it, but we'll not go into that. Yes, I'm sure loads of metro gets shared build. Yeah. Yeah, there's loads of people who have, shared council assets that they've all got subducts in. Zayo is obviously the biggest example of using the sewers, but there's other places where what was H2O networks, for example, did a lot in the sewers. So outside of London mostly, but there's a few people who have stuff in the sewers. H2O is now part of City Fibre. So there's a lot of attempts to try and share that, but not necessarily in big ways. Vodafone is an interesting one because obviously all the different companies that they acquired, and many of those networks are overlapping. So you find that the Thus network that was originally built had some stuff that overlapped with, say, Norweb that they acquired. And then Cable and Wireless had the Mercury network and Energist network and everything else. And that was overlapping all of those other things. So in some places, Vodafone own 3 or 4 different duct networks that they may or may not be using. They may or may not have interconnected them all, but they're all there. And Norweb, again, was a build share with Fiberway, which is now Sky. Just give you an example of what that looks like. That's a build share one set of ducts down the street, two sets of boxes, so that they can each have their own fibre joints. They've each got access to their own ducts, but they slew the ducts off into two different boxes. So that one is in Edinburgh. That's a Norweb and Sky box just near Pulson. So how to build your own? First thing you need is permission. Now we're not talking so much about community broadband and things like that because they're done a bit more informally and may or may not follow these processes and generally rely on a lot of goodwill. But assuming you don't know the people and you have to get permission, private land, you have to get a way leave, or in the case of if you have code powers, you can apply for what's called an easement, which is more of a forcing your hand. You can't really deny it. Power companies use easements a lot, where they have to put power in somewhere, they have to get off a pylon, which is in a farmer's field or whatever it might be. But they're a very similar sort of legal instrument. Public land, obviously, you have to get either a notice if you're code operators or permits. You have to either be submitting permits with, so in England that's a section 50, or in Scotland it's a section 119. Those aren't necessarily guaranteed. The council can say no. Councils act in very awkward and different ways in whether or not they're going to grant you it, whether or not they're going to let you do it. They can be expensive, which is why if you're serious about building a telecoms network, you apply for code powers from Ofcom, and that puts you as a roads authority would call you a statutory undertaker, and at that point you can put notices in and do whatever you want, really. Well, not whatever you want, but you've got a lot more freedom. So you can either do this yourself. It is possible, although difficult, especially if you're working in a public highway, to do it yourself. More common in rural places where it's more straightforward to do it. There's less of a pressure from the various authorities. If you are going to do it in the public space, you need New Roads and Streetworks Act Streetworks cards. So that's a supervisor and an operative. There's two different training courses you have to go on to get those cards. Once you've got those, you can work in the street, whether that's on fibre jointing or working a digger or whatever it might be. You have to have the appropriate certificates for actually operating the machine plant that you're using, whatever that might be. Big one and a big cost that people forget about is traffic management. So moving cars, for example, that are parked over your manhole, that's a simple form of traffic management, although expensive and a pain in the arse. All the way to closing roads, what they call TTROs, temporary traffic restriction orders, which is actually telling the council to shut a road, put up temporary traffic lights, whatever it might be. That is often contracted out because it comes with its own whole layer of legislation and difficulties. So companies like Contraflow and A-Class and all these people who are traffic management companies would just do that on behalf of a civils contractor or yourself if you're doing it DIY. If you do have code powers, you have to access the roads authority systems to lodge your noticing and communicate with the roads authority and whether or not that notice is accepted or whether there's any restrictions on the road or whatever else. And if there are restrictions, you have to potentially work around them. So things like in Scotland, we have a section 117. I don't know what it is in England, but that's where a road has been recently resurfaced, and they basically say if you want to dig across this road, you have to reinstate a full 15-metre panel for the full width, curb to curb of the road, which is enormously expensive if all you want is a 300mm track across it. So these things can get in the way, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can either reroute your network to go a different way or pay to reinstate the road. The other thing to watch out for is warranties. So you have to actually warranty, I think it's 2 years you have to warranty your work for. Generally that's passed off to your contractor, so you would get them to warranty it, but if you're doing it DIY, you would have to take that on yourself, and if there's any defects in your reinstatement, then you have to do it again. If you're using a contractor, this is again day job, building a box in the middle of Glasgow, where this is a slip road off the M8. hugely costly because we had to close the hard shoulder on the M8 on the slip road off, so like a mile of cones down the M8 just because it was coming, you know, it's really, really difficult sometimes just because of the way the council will view it. That's an off-road from a big motorway, so you've got to do X, Y, and Z traffic management. The costs that I've put there are indicative of city centre, 120 quid a metre. I think the Openreach ECC's price is £116 a metre at the moment, so they kind of take the rough with the smooth. It could be more in a city centre that's got really difficult traffic management requirements. It could be less in a really quiet place. Generally speaking, footway, so if you're going down a pavement, 60 quid a metre. Often you might plan to go down a pavement, but there's so many other utilities in the pavement, you just can't get near it, and you're forced to go in the carriageway. And soft verge, if you can get it and it's clear, 20 quid a metre. Again, this is assuming you're paying a contractor to do all this on a sort of per metre rate. Building chambers are, you know, anywhere between £1,000 and £3,000, assuming you're doing a whole load of work at the same time. So it's an expensive business, and that's why we have things like Openreach PIA. That's why all the examples of the people that we've seen there don't necessarily want to just overbuild everyone. They want to do shares, they want to lease fibre, they want to lease subduct. And so there's an enormous amount of that going on. And it's predicated from those costs there. And they've been relatively static over the years because it's just the cost of labour, really. It's not so much the cost of materials, it's the cost of labour. So what else do you need? Permits and all the rest of it are done. The only thing that's a big gotcha for us is the liabilities. So again, 2-year warranty on reinstatements, and they do core drill test them. So you need to actually make sure it's not going to subside because they will go around core drilling your reinstatements and check them. If you've buried your duct too short, they'll go through it. So make sure you don't do that. Huge fines these days for any health and safety violations. We had a contractor working for a telco that I won't name who didn't put traffic management out while he was in a manhole, and someone caught him on dash cam as cars were swerving around him, and I think it was a 6-figure fine that they ended up having to deal with, which is just for that one dash cam video. It was just terrifying. And yes, absolutely, and that has happened. There has been contractors who have had operatives in the street die, and there's been corporate manslaughter cases against them. So the other thing is code powers. If you're applying for code powers, you have to have what they call funds for liabilities, which is usually a large bond. So not everyone can do it. You can theoretically insure against it, but I've yet to find an insurance company who will do that. So there's that to worry about as well. And the last thing you need is possibly a tent. As we found recently, that's me and our fibre guy, Duncan, we were actually getting an Openreach OSA installed into one of our street cabinets, and ADVA turned up and said, you must supply a tent, because it might rain. So we had to buy a tent. Any questions? Hopefully I've not.
Any questions for Charlie?
You don't. You just hope it doesn't blow wind too hard. Anyone else?
Oh, go on.
Just your opinion on BT Filter Connect that's just been launched,
Yeah.
because that seems to be changing a lot of the decisions now. You're in the price per meter, the ability to do your own services. Do you see that
I think
reducing the amount of self-builds?
Possibly. I think it'll be interesting to see how people. I mean, obviously, the vast majority of we're talking about Openreach Filter Connects. Openreach have had the OSA product for a while. Filter Connect allows you to effectively light alien wavelengths over what was a managed DWDM platform. So yes, I think it will help for things like mobile backhaul, especially with 5G, where there's a need for much more high bandwidth services, and the cost per 10 gig is reduced. There's still a high cost. It's not like everyone can get access to it, and it's certainly not as simple as it was going to be if Openreach were going to be forced to sell dark fibre. But it is certainly handy in certain circumstances. The Filter Connect product's been there for a long time, and this is really just reducing the cost of it. Yes, the technical thing, you know, being able to put your own waves down, it gives you a bit more flexibility, but actually you'd be surprised, Openreach have been doing very complex DWDM solutions on the OSA product set for a long time, and ultimately I think this is just a cost thing. So
Right. It's the price per metre that's really dropped it down.
it's not going to affect the price per metre, no. I mean, I think you still need to get fibre to it, and the Openreach price for fibre, for duct and cable and everything else hasn't materially changed as a result of the OSA Filter Connect. So it's not going to change the cost of anything like that. It's just another product for accessing Openreach fibre, which has some flexibility that we didn't have before. But otherwise, nothing's changed.
Excellent. Any more questions? Oh, one more.
Is there a standard for how frequently you have to have a manhole?
No, not at all. It is usually as far as you're prepared to blow fibre. So I think these days you can blow fibre over a couple of kilometres if you really wanted to. I think you'd be mad not to put chambers in every few hundred yards, but yeah, you can theoretically blow a cable. You could have a subduct, continuous subduct for 2 kilometres and comfortably blow over that distance. The other thing to remember is if you ever do have problems, you can actually build, a common thing is to build a network with no chambers and drop them in afterwards. So the way that you would do, even if there's live cables and things in it, you excavate around the ducts, you build your, because the rings that create the manholes can be put underneath, holes made for them for the ducts that go through, and then more rings put on top. And then at the last minute, once you've finished making that chamber, you can actually saw the duct that was originally there, exposing the cables and subducts inside it. So it's actually relatively straightforward and quite common to build a chamber over an existing network to create a breakout point. So it's not that important, actually.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Charlie.